Good morning. This is the morning update of the LaRouche organization for August 28th. So there's a lot happening, and I think many of us are feeling that the world is moving in two extreme opposite directions very, very rapidly. On the one hand, the global south, the BRICS nations, have three major events coming up in the next 2 weeks. The first being the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, where they are expecting heads of state from 20 different nations. And while your next door neighbor may not be able to find these nations on a map, they're very significant. China and India each have 1.4 billion people. And I suggest perhaps you take out a map and look up where these nations are and how large they are so you can see how significant this is. China, Russia, Belarus, India, Iran, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Pakistan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Mongolia, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Cambodia, Maldives, Nepal, Turkey, Egypt, Turkmenistan, Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, and Vietnam. That's a lot of people and a lot of nations with very advanced scientific capabilities, particularly China, Russia, India, Pakistan, Iran. And they are going to be talking about all kinds of things: economic cooperation, security agreements with each other, extremely important. And because the United States has foolishly insisted on slapping these super tariffs on the BRICS nations like India and Brazil, supposedly to somehow get people to stop trading with Russia, which just isn't going to happen. You have to remember, the United States has 340 million people or so. That's 4% of the world's population. We import, or we account for, and only 10% of India's exports. We account for only 13% of Brazil's exports. So if the tariffs make it prohibitive, they'll just go elsewhere, and indeed they are. And in fact, it's rumored, I don't know if it's true, that Prime Minister Modi has rejected 4 phone calls from President Trump in the last days. So in this case, I guess you could say President Trump is uniting India and China, and he is a peacemaker after all. So those countries will quickly resolve any differences they have so as not to be harmed by the aggressive economic policies coming from the United States. Also, we have the Vladivostok, the Eastern Economic Forum, which is very, very large. I think it's something like 20,000 people will be there, all kinds of scientific projects, the development of the Arctic. Now, happily, aside from the foolishness and short-sightedness and destructive nature of the tariffs, President Trump's meeting in Alaska continues to be the point of reference for Russia. So the Russians are repeating that they intend to not only restore normal diplomatic relations with the United States, but engage in several joint economic endeavors. Hopefully one of those will be the Bering Strait Tunnel, but also Siberia is very rich in rare earths, precious metals, etc. So it could be a win-win partnership if the U.S. would work with Russia there. And for his part, President Trump seems to be sticking to his commitment for peace, although I thought the remarks by whoever that young twerp was at the UN Security Council yesterday or 2 days ago representing the United States was really obnoxious. When Ambassador Polyansky brought up the Nords, he insisted, given that they've just arrested a suspect in the fairy tale 15-meter long yacht that had a bunch of amateurs who could dive 80 meters below the surface of the sea to detonate the Nord Stream pipelines. I mean, this is just the most absurd story. And so the Russian Federation demanded a hearing. And the position of the American there was to say, why are you wasting our time on this? We've already talked about it. It shouldn't be brought up here. President Trump is very interested in ending the suffering in the Ukraine-Russia war, and he is concentrated on getting a negotiated peace settlement, and we suggest that you do the same, which is really pompous, I must say. Some of the other nations were more outrageous, and the Chinese actually said, what is that? They said, how can you do an investigation for 3 years and not come up with anything and have nothing to share with the Security Council? This is not credible. And our concern is that you have a state actor or a terrorist organization that carried out a major act of terrorism on a major infrastructure project, and no one will have been brought to justice. This has very bad implications for other major infrastructure around the world, which is true. Not to mention the price of energy in Germany has increased 3 or 4 times, but Chancellor Merz doesn't care about that. He just wants to arm Ukraine in preparation for a war with Russia. So the Vladivostok summit is happening. And then, of course, you have September 3rd, which is the 80th anniversary of the Chinese receiving the surrender of the Japanese. The surrender to the Americans on the USS Missouri was September 2nd, with remarkable remarks from General Douglas MacArthur. And the surrender to the Chinese was on September 3rd. And President Putin, President Xi, President Modi, all will be there. Thousands of people. China will be demonstrating their newest military technology. As you know, Helga Zeppler-Rouge has put out an appeal that President Trump be invited to that and should accept. I don't know whether that's going to happen now at this late date, but it certainly would be very, very useful. Now, the elephant in the room for all of this is the bankruptcy of the financial system, particularly the transatlantic financial system. And in the webcast I did with Helga Zeppler-Rouge yesterday, she brought up what she thought had to be taken note of, the fact that President Trump is trying to fire Liz Clark, I think her name is, at the Federal Reserve, that he's frustrated that they're not pushing down the interest rates. And this, of course, will wreak havoc with the economy, which is already in tatters. Between that and the disruptions of the supply chain, because foreign workers will no longer be able to get visas for driving trucks. We have a shortage of truck drivers, and the Medicaid cuts are going to lead to the closure of probably hundreds of hospitals in poor rural areas across the United States. So you have a great potential for upheaval, and the National Guard is being deployed into our cities. Now, I have to say I'm not thrilled with the level of crime in American cities, including New York. I think there's a number of factors. One is certainly cuts to the police force. The big one is the economy and the drug trade, the full-on legalization of recreational drugs, marijuana in a very high potency, and who knows what else has been very damaging. And the shutdown of mental hospitals. The United States has eliminated 90% of our inpatient capacity at mental hospitals since the late 1950s. So all of these make a terrible situation in our inner cities. But the U.S. military should not be deployed in any way against the American people. This sets a very dangerous precedent. And what Helga Zeppler-Rouge was raising is, are they preparing for the kind of unrest you might get when people can't buy groceries, when their bank accounts are emptied by the crash, etc.? I don't know. It's an important question. And in fact, a U.S. economist named Kenneth Rogoff has written an article in Foreign Affairs magazine called "America's Coming Crash: Will Washington's Debt Addiction Spark the Next Global Crisis?" And he makes the point that U.S. federal debt has doubled in the last 5 years and continues to grow explosively. And he said that this is a new, what he calls financial repression, when you lower the interest rates, which he says suppresses credit and slows economic growth, as it causes inflation because you're just issuing money to bail out money, not for production, pushes long-term interest rates up, even as short-term rates are forced down. And C, it pushes the Treasury to issue new debt overwhelmingly as short-term Treasury bills. He concludes that this can bring on another financial crisis soon and could cause a U.S. sovereign default. So that's where we're headed. Lyndon LaRouche was the world's leading economist. What he proposed, his 4 laws, starting with the implementation of Glass-Steagall, that is the separation of the banks, forcing us to sort through the banks and determine what's legitimate debt, what's illegitimate debt, protecting people's savings, protecting mortgages, pensions, that kind of thing, which the government can do, and then let all this other garbage go. If a billionaire only becomes a multimillionaire, I think that he will survive. But if our sewage treatment plants cannot function, or transportation systems shut down, or the fire departments and hospitals aren't funded, people will die. And the government has an obligation to promote the general welfare. That's what it says in our Constitution. So it's quite a turbulent time. I think we are ripe for a new order, and that's what we must fight for.